Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Personalization Outbreak Podcast. Our guest today is Ben Ahrens. Now, Ben is a chronic illness recovery expert, neuroplasticity coach, and CEO of Rewiring, a science-based brain retraining program for anxiety, depression, and chronic illness recovery. Now, having personally overcome debilitating chronic Lyme disease, Ben used self-directed neuroplasticity and is now dedicated to empowering others to reclaim their lives, health, and happiness. See, Ben holds advanced certifications in biological medicine and is an AADP board-certified holistic health practitioner in the state of New York. You are listening to Personalization Outbreak, a podcast about the collapse of traditional corporate standards in today's more personalized world. I'm Llopis. I'm a leadership strategist, author, contributor to Forbes, and founder of the Leadership in the Age of Personalization movement. On this show, I'm interviewing executives across multiple sectors to find out how the balance between standardization and personalization can exist. Now, Ben, a lot of great things that you've done and a lot of great things about the person that you are, but I'm really excited about you being here today because you have quite a story to share. So thanks for joining the show today.
Yeah, Glenn, thanks so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to having this chat with you.
So Ben, why have you always been so fascinated with how people can change their bodies and minds through their own actions? In fact, maybe you should define that for us, because we hear words like that and it feels like it's so simple, but it's not.
Yeah. Okay. So for me, I think it was actually really tangible from a young age. Like it is for many people, like there are some people that are just curious about how things work. My favorite book, even growing up, was that book called The Way Things Work with the woolly mammoths. And they had all the gears and how the inside of a phone works and all these kinds of things. And I was that kid that would take things apart, rip the windshield wipers off my dad's car and try and figure out literally, and physically just how stuff worked. Then when I was in my middle school years, I got really into just the human body and abilities. I enjoyed learning skills like juggling and balancing. I learned how to ride a unicycle. It didn't quite fit into the conventional mold of like athleticism. And I remember actually getting a very concerned note or message from my gym teacher saying that I had very poor hand-eye coordination. The reason being was that I never, ever practiced playing things like basketball or, tennis. I just wasn't really into team sports. Of course, when my parents saw that, they laughed because here I was at 10 years old, juggling fire, literally. But I was just interested in the mechanics of how you could go from having an idea in your head, like I want to learn a skill, to actually practicing a series of exercises such that it would lead to the realization of that intention in a very tangible and, sort of measurable way. Then in my teens, of course, as a somewhat of a scrawny kid, I got into exercise physiology and, working out. And it was the same fascination, just renewed. It was like, okay, now my idea is to change the physical shape and function of my body. Are there exercises or things that I can learn that can do that? And as it turns out, of course, we know that through bodybuilding and all sorts of training methods, there are protocols you can use that can absolutely change your body. And so I found that even more fascinating. And that fascination just continued until my mid-20s. I was making that my career, working as an exercise physiologist, helping people develop their bodies, their minds, also working with people that had been through strokes and injuries to regain the functions that they had lost. And then during that time, around age 25, I hit a wall. I encountered a problem that I couldn't solve using only this mechanistic thinking that had gotten me that far. I got completely sick with what turned out to be neurologic Lyme disease, and all of my training, my lifestyle, skills, my nutritional input really fell short here. I wasn't able to recover my health after weeks and months and what would eventually turn into years. And it caused me to go, even deeper. And that's something we can, get further into as well.
Yeah. So let's go back. You said the intent. What was the intent? Like, of all of this curiosity, what was the intent? Where did you think that this was taking you?
So I used to think that the intent was to construct ourselves, was to improve ourselves through our own, intentions. I have since come to realize that the intent is more of a self-actualization. There is this wonderful saying that actually comes from physics, which goes that potential will always convert to actual whenever conditions permit. And to me, what that does is it really changes our role in personal development, physical development, reclaiming health, whatever it might be. It changes our role from the doer, from the one that needs to construct or impose our own idea of what this, brain and body should do, to more of a cultivator, someone who is merely cultivating the conditions such that whatever is really meant to arise and to thrive can happen in that way. And as it turns out, that seems to be very much in alignment with how the human body and the human being actually functions, and how we not only arrive at or regain, but ultimately sustain long-term our health and well-being.
So what do you think our body and mind were made to do?
It's interesting. I just actually got back from a conference in Sweden called the Alpine Fellowship, and every year it has a topic. The topic of this one was flourishing. And so from everything that I have experienced in my life, from everything that I've learned intellectually and experientially, I really believe that our body, our mind, us as human beings, individuals, as well as even on a societal level, that we are meant to thrive and to flourish. We know on a biological level that we have this state of being called homeostasis, which is the state at which everything is sort of functioning optimally and self-managing. And I believe that, again, given the right conditions, and if we can help cultivate those conditions in ourselves and outside of ourselves, that our body's natural propensity is to be healthy, is to flourish, and ultimately is to thrive.
That's inspiring. It really is, but it also makes me wonder, why are we not thriving enough? I think this kind of goes back to standardization, right? When you're conditioned to think that you have to do a certain thing to get to where you need to go, without injecting any sense of self. This is maybe why we're being held back and not flourishing. And maybe this is why people get so frustrated, because they know that there's something else out there, but they're being restricted to go towards that intentional goal, and then feel a little bit too held back. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, what comes to mind, it's interesting when you were just describing that feeling of restriction. It's almost like coming up against a wall. It's like there's something inside that is trying to move forward, that's trying to do what it naturally does to flourish. And then it's met with some resistance, right? And we know that whenever something is moving in one direction and it's being resisted in another, that leads to tension and stress. And so coming back to your question, which is, I think, the question, if the natural orientation of the body is to be healthy and to thrive, then why do we get sick? That is the question I certainly found myself asking when I was 25 and I was starting to, gain an understanding of all of these things. And I was like, okay, so I like this concept. This resonates with me, that health is the natural state. Then why can't I get better? Why did I get sick in the first place? And I remember listening in on this conference of this Dr. Thomas Rao, who's a practitioner of European biological medicine. In biological medicine, they're, I think, quite a bit ahead of where we are in the West. They really understand that that the body has this innate self-healing capacity. And the role of a physician in that modality is really to reestablish self-healing and self-management. They know that healing doesn't come from the doctor or from the medicine. It comes from the patient or the person. And the role of the doctor is just to kind of reinvigorate or help that person reclaim their ability to self-heal. And so I'm listening to this. I'm like, yeah, this is great. This makes sense. I love it. Why can't I get better? Why isn't this happening for me? And in this seminar, Dr. Rao even mentions that about as many as 40 people or more, 40% of people in the Northeast, if you test them and pull them off the street, will test positive for Borrelia, which is the Lyme-causing bacteria. But out of that 40%, far less than 2% actually get sick and exhibit symptoms. And we know that this is true for just about everything, including, what we saw recently with COVID, but even the common cold virus breezes through a room of 10 people. Statistically speaking, 3 of them will get sick and symptomatic, and 7 of them will remain completely symptom-free. And so this started the thought process. Well, there's got to be something else at play here. It's not just the environment, right? It's not just what's coming at us from the environment that determines our health or our success or our well-being. It's also how and why our bodies respond. And so that led to the investigation. Okay, well, what determines our body's response? And that's a whole other rabbit hole we can lead down. But essentially,
but you know what, Ben? We're actually, this is where what I like you're going is that we're all dealing with this right now. The environment can be a workplace environment. The environment can be society. I mean, the environment can be the friends that you decide to associate yourself with, and then you have to make a choice as an individual. And so, how do you prepare your body and mind to withstand this pushback that environments create, these limitations, these restrictions, as we discussed earlier? And so this makes a lot of sense to me, because maybe we're learning that the environment that we're in today is just too much for what the mind and body were made to grapple with. And so before you go there, I'd really like to go back, probably a time that you don't want to remember, when you were bedridden for 3 years with chronic Lyme disease. So Ben, how did you really begin to, I want the people listening and watching to imagine you in bed, and I've seen these pictures of you with all these cords on you. How were you reevaluating your purpose in life? And how did you find that inner will, that strength to start reinventing yourself? Because the cells reproduced, but you had to make a mental decision on how they were going to reproduce. Is that a fair question?
Yes. So my mind actually goes back to a few years prior to that, prior to even getting sick. It's a bit of a tale of two cities, best of times, worst of times scenario. But this was in about 2006, shortly after I had graduated college. I remember I moved to Maui to fulfill my life's dream to become a surf bum and have no responsibilities. And I did that, and it was great. But something fairly unexpected happened after a few months there, which is I found myself becoming depressed. I found myself kind of hitting a wall mentally. And even though I was 22, young, healthy, vital and everything, when I was in that dark place, it was even compounded and made worse by the fact that I was sort of in paradise. So I looked around the environment, and there was no outside reason why I should be feeling that way, which made me feel, even that much more terrible. But interestingly, my body started to sort of follow suit. I started to get these aches and pains. I ended up getting a kind of kink in my knee that didn't heal, and ended up after about 6 months bringing me home. And, that was always something that kind of stuck with me a little bit. I tried to shake it off, and I think my grandfather's advice, who said, follow your curiosity. And that led me back into, exercise science and everything. And it just helped me keep busy. But then once I started to get really sick with the Lyme, and now really sick on a physical level, to the point where you were speaking about, where in about 2009, 2010, by this point, I couldn't walk. I had severe migrating pains that would shift around my body. I had tremors. I had been to about 30 different doctors. I had brain scans, EKGs, spinal taps. My brain looked like that of an MS patient, and that was one of the diagnoses that I received. Multiple brain lesions in the frontal cortex. My prognosis was not good. I had received about 14 or 15 diagnoses of various chronic, said to be intractable conditions, including juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, of course, chronic Lyme disease, and then the offshoot of all of these so-called secondary conditions that can happen, like dysautonomia and sensitivities to chemicals, light, sound, electromagnetic fields, you name it. I probably had it, and my life started to just exist in a dark room. So here I am, say, 3, 4, 5 years earlier, I was in Maui in paradise, but feeling utterly depressed. And here I was, 4 or 5 years later, my worst case scenario became a reality, and begging for those Maui days of depression. Looked like, a sunshine compared to where I was. But I remember this one, instance where I had been struggling for so long, struggling to find the right approaches, to find the right doctors, the right information, struggling physically to just keep myself out of pain on a daily basis. And nothing was working. Every move I made seemed to only get me deeper into that hole. And, you mentioned earlier, like, it's not like I knew what I was doing or knew what to do at the time. I certainly didn't, but I would say that I knew what not to do, or had some sense, maybe it was even some higher wisdom in me, said, okay, the path of struggling is not working. So in this moment, some higher wisdom in me prompted me to take one deep breath and just let out this huge sigh. I actually ended up giving a TED talk about this with the title, One Deep Breath, because of the profundity of this experience. But on the other side of that breath, I found something that I hadn't experienced in probably my entire life, which was a tiny little pocket of space, a little pocket of expansion, where I could, for the first time ever, feel myself almost on a cellular level, as it turns out, actually on a cellular level, to really exhale and to really relax. And then, of course, my thoughts started spinning back up, and I was right back where I started, but something remained, and it was that experience that I just couldn't let go of. And so I was like, okay, that's interesting. What is that? And how can I get back there? And so it became a practice of mine, because there was almost nothing that I could control at the time, to just take one deep breath whenever I found myself getting consumed by the discomfort, consumed by the symptoms, and most importantly, consumed by the mental anguish of feeling like I had no future. So when I found myself in that place, I would take this one deep breath. And the more often I practiced that, two things happened. One, I could get there more reliably. So more frequently, I could revisit that little space. And two, each time I did, it seemed to expand a little bit further, so I could stay there a little bit longer. And I remember in one instance, I decided to just really see where that led. And I continued to sort of take these breaths and relax my body each time on the exhale. I encountered so many layers of resistance, so much, whatever, I don't even know to this day exactly what it is, old wiring or past experience, but things coming up inside me saying, don't do this. Don't let go. Don't, keep pushing. But I had been down that road again, and it hadn't gotten me anywhere. So I kept letting go. And for about 45 minutes on this one occasion, kept on practicing this. And then something incredible happened. My entire body seemed to just disappear and fade away. I'll set the scene a little bit here. I was in a really cramped studio apartment in Manhattan. But in that instance, there were, traffic and noise and loud sounds outside. But in that moment, it was like everything just kind of melded together. And I know this saying goes, I was kind of one with the surroundings and everything, but in a way, that's really how it felt. There was no body, there was no self there. There was just the awareness of my own existence. And it was one of the most beautiful and glorious experiences I had ever had, just to create that sort of juxtaposition. Rewind that 5 years ago, here I am in paradise in Maui, in absolute hell, mental anguish, devastation, and eventually led to this physical, decline. Here I am in this moment, ostensibly in the worst case scenario, don't have my health, brain lesions, no prospects for the future. And in that moment, I found my highest happiness. The really interesting thing that happened was that after that moment, I stood up, I kind of came back into my body, and I didn't find any symptoms. I didn't find any pain. For 3 days that followed, I was completely pain and symptom free. I was, for all intents and purposes, healed. And then slowly, after a few days, symptoms started to creep back in, thoughts and anxieties started to creep back in. And I looked around the environment, the room where I was, and I saw that, I still had these IV poles and these oxygen tanks and these medical papers and all of these things. And so I was sort of back in that, in that condition. But once more, something remained, and it was the knowledge that this other option existed. And so then my mission became about, how can I get back there?
Ben, this is fascinating. And look, I want to make sure that our audience knows that, you live this. This is real. And as I think about people who are living these types of things every day, you said the two words that got my attention. You gave yourself the space to let go. And I have to believe that part of, and this is the work, part of the work that your team does at Reorigin is helping people rewire their brains. What part of that process does letting go play? Because when we're trying to help self-direct people to change their own behavior, I've got to believe that letting go is a big part of this.
Yeah. So, coming back around to that question of why do we get sick in the first place? What is that buildup? As it turns out, there is this thing in neuroscience known as the allostatic load, which is essentially a total cumulative load that builds up. So you could think of it as a total load of tension that builds up on the nervous system. And as human beings, we are incredibly resilient. If you think of what people can go through mentally, physically, emotionally, it's amazing actually how resilient we are. But like any biological system, we also have some limitations. And when that total load of stress, be it mental, physical, pathogenic, emotional, whatever it might be, whenever it builds up faster than is our capacity to recover from it, that is when we experience some form of breakdown. Oftentimes physical symptoms will emerge. And this really goes hand in hand with the biological medicine model, where they often, to give a visual, they'll put this big barrel up on the screen and say, okay, this is like our immune system, our nervous system. It can handle all of these different things. We can handle, genetic abnormalities. We can handle adverse childhood experiences, latent pathogenic infections, nutritional deficiencies, and on it goes. But at a certain point, if something comes in, and usually it's something acute. So a lot of times what will happen is people have this buildup of stress, right? Buildup of all of these different things. And keep in mind here, one thing really important to note is that the brain and body make no differentiation between psychological stress and between a physical stressor. If we have a high pathogenic load, a lot of people can handle that. Like we mentioned, cold virus comes through the room. Not everyone gets sick from it. Most don't. But when we have a high pathogenic load and then the boss yells at us, right? Or then we get into a fight with the spouse, or then we go on a 24-hour flight to wherever, that is what usually functions as this sort of straw that breaks the camel's back. But the camel's back might not have broken if it wasn't already carrying such a heavy load. So our role becomes very much about reducing that load and bringing it back to this notion of where does letting go come in? Well, letting go, and we can take that in a very, to me, in a very literal and physical way, like I did, actually just letting go of tension, letting go of muscle tension, exhaling, can really have a profound impact on reducing that allostatic load and therefore increasing our resilience and ability to handle things that come at us from the environment.
Well, this is, and we talked about this, when we were preparing for this interview, that I'm seeing people that, even though our bodies and minds were meant to be resilient, just aren't as resilient as they should be. I'm actually seeing people becoming and feeling so hopeless and disconnected from their purpose, let alone why they wake up every day, to see that as the environment becomes more complicated, whether what's going on in the world, wars, climate change, political dynamics, social media, it goes back to this load. How much of a load can we really handle? And I think as the load increases, we become less resilient, and thus less resilient or not resilient enough to do what you did. And that is have the will and the strength to reinvent yourself. So when you think of resilience and reinvention, they're very much interconnected. So what would you tell somebody right now who feels like their body and mind is breaking down? How do you get them back on track to be more resilient and reinvention ready, Ben?
So the number one thing to note is that even though you might feel stuck and stressed, and that might very well be the case, right? It's a very real experience. Your body and your brain are actually still very much working for you. Even actually that propensity to become stressed and overwhelmed is the brain trying to work for you. It's trying to do what it has evolved to do and thinks is best. So the brain's first order of business is to ensure your survival. And in order to do this, it sometimes errs on the side of caution by classifying things in the environment as threats. And these can be things like news that we hear, media, even flashing lights, scrolling on social media.
Or a transformation in the organization. Go ahead.
Transformation in the organization, change in career, all of these things are absolutely, stress inducing. Where the brain has not evolved is to distinguish which of these stressors are life-threatening and which are not. And so because it hasn't evolved that mechanism, I don't know if it will or not, that remains to be seen. It errs on the side of caution and says, you know what, we don't know. So let's just err on the side of caution here and classify these things as dangerous so that we can alert the person to change the situation. And how does it alert us? Well, it alerts us by elevating our levels of cortisol, elevating our heart rate, elevating our blood pressure, giving us these sensations that are feelings of anxiety. And of course, normally what we do now in our society is we we try and avoid feeling that way, which is another natural response. When we feel discomfort, every natural, intention of any creature is to be biased against the discomfort. And so we try and move away from it. But actually by doing that, we sort of unwittingly allow it to build up and build up and build up until it gets to that breaking point. So if anyone is at that point, number one thing to note is it's not your fault. This is your brain doing its best, trying to work for you. Number two, your body is still resilient. It still absolutely has the ability to self-heal. And number three, there are things, very specific things that you can do with your own mind and brain and intention to start to change these conditions to essentially reverse the trend that's been happening.
So how do you get people to reverse? How do you get them to rewire?
Yeah. So this is what I've really dedicated my life to, and what that next level of fascination, led me to over the past decade is once I, just to pick up actually where I left off in my own healing story, after I experienced that sort of miraculous instance of being symptom-free for a small period of time, my research led me into, of course, this notion of spontaneous recovery, which turns out to be a real thing. But also, one of the things to note about spontaneous recovery is it's spontaneous. It's very hard to replicate, and it's very hard to sustain. So my mission became, well, how do I sustain this? How do I create the conditions that will allow that recovery to remain long-term? And that is ultimately what led me up the chain from the body to the brain to this concept of neuroplasticity, and how your brain, as the sort of chief choreographer of all of the body's cells and organs and systems, can really conduct this orchestra in harmony if given the right cues. So basically, I got really deep into how we can signal new messages back to the brain, took cues from different areas of work like PRT, which is pain reprocessing therapy, CBT, somatic experiencing, found that there was a lot of different practices and disciplines that had pieces of the puzzle. And then through my next level of career, I ended up working with a lot of different types of medical doctors, and we ended up putting together sort of these puzzle pieces to create a protocol that I had ad hoc put together for myself that could really work for more people. And so now, fortunately, like this idea of brain retraining is becoming a thing. You can Google brain retraining or limbic system retraining and see that people are using these protocols to recover from anxiety, depression, chronic fatigue syndrome, and a whole host of complex conditions. So the information is out there, but to really distill it down so people can already start to take action and move the needle, I would say the number one thing is simply becoming aware of whatever you're feeling in your body. Again, I think so much in this day and age, we are motivated by or driven, not even consciously motivated, but internally driven to avoid discomfort. And what I would encourage people to do is, first and foremost, as uncomfortable as it may be by definition, feel into however you're feeling and see if you can relax, exhale into that experience, whatever it might be. Number two, ask yourself, how do I want to feel instead? I think that's something that we oftentimes don't even think to do or don't even realize is an option that's available to us. And when we start to ask better questions, we get better answers. So maybe you ask yourself, how do I want to feel instead of how I'm feeling in this moment? Maybe the answer that you get is, I want to feel calm or at ease, or maybe it's excited or motivated, whatever it might be. Once you have that answer, the next question would be, is there something I can do to foster that feeling? Is there something I can change in my environment, in how I hold my posture and how I'm breathing, perhaps, and what I'm looking at that can guide me more in that direction? And then it really comes down to a matter of practicing and interrupting these old patterns and replacing them with a new sort of desired response. So at the end of the day, there's a bit more nuance that goes into it from an actual neuroscience and brain retraining perspective. But at the end of the day, the steps of rewiring yourself are not necessarily complicated. They're just not easy because it's not what we're used to practicing unwittingly throughout the day.
Hey, Ben, we can talk forever about this. I want to thank you so much for being on the show. And, look, I've been in the business of, behavior change now for nearly 17 years. And I'm a big believer that people can rewire themselves to be what they want to be. And I've seen it. But how do you get there? It's a true conscious effort to think about what you want to be and the commitment that you have, like you said, to keep practicing. But see, that's not what the environment has always encouraged. It's keep up, do more. No gain, no pain, no gain, right? It's promoted us to go well beyond what we were really made for. And as resilient as our mind, body, and minds give us the ability to be, that takes work. And what I'm taking away here is that we can't take advantage of the bodies and mind that we have. We have to embrace them and connect with them and recognize they're actually a responsibility. They're a gift. And what you choose to do with it is what is ultimately going to take you to those points of happiness or not, those points of health or not. So thank you so much. I don't know, how did I do as a student today? Am I doing okay?
You're doing great. You're doing great. I think we're right on point. And I just wanted to mention one thing that, you mentioned, and then I said in response, I think just before we hit record, you mentioned something about the work I was doing. And I said kind of just off the cuff, like, oh yeah, you just wake up every day and you do the best you can. And I think the important thing to pull from this idea is based on, what you were saying. There's so much information out there today when it comes to especially change and personal development on, 10xing this and pushing for that. And we are so used to shooting for the moon and using these mechanisms of exertion. And there's a time and a place for that, perhaps when it comes, for boosting motivation. But what actually does the change, and there's neuroscience and biology to back this up, is consistency over time. And I think the reason that so many people don't change is because it's so simple that you miss it. You think there's no way this could work for me if I just make these little changes, consistently. But it's those seemingly insignificant things that stack up to ultimately and radically change the way you feel and function in the world. So if I could leave, people with just one message here, it's no matter how you might feel overwhelmed, stuck, you're not stuck. Everything is in motion. Everything is changing. And you can certainly be the direction or guide the direction into which that change proceeds.
Henceforth, leadership in the age of personalization. Ben, thank you so much. We'll continue this conversation in the future. But as we end every show, when you lead in the age of personalization, you will see things that others don't. Do what others won't, and keep pushing till prudence says quit. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you, Glenn.
Thanks for listening to Personalization Outbreak. Make sure to subscribe so you never miss a show. If you enjoyed the content, visit ageofpersonalization.com to check out our free streaming video series and learn how to get involved in the movement. I'm Glenn Llopis. I wish you a good day, and remember, without strategy, change is merely substitution, not evolution.